All right, my people, let's talk a little bit about you, talking about me, talking about philosophy. Today, we're going to cover some interesting stuff that came up in the comment section to this video, which was about the moral argument and a universal objective moral law. Some of the super interesting stuff that you brought up that I'm going to touch on today: what the hell I'm doing, metaethics, moral psychology, ethics, teaching philosophy, philosophical experts and novices in the YouTube comment sections, the is-ought fallacy, descriptive and normative flavors of evolutionary ethics, teleology, purpose and survival, personhood, some mistakes I made in talking about personhood, moral obligation and moral law and moral facts. Then I'll try to apply this sort of moral law or conception of personhood to some contemporary ethical issues, including but not limited to same-sex relationships, driving a car into boatloads of people in New Orleans, blowing up a Tesla in Vegas, scammers, scambaiters, and without question my favorite scambaiting Twitch streamer of all time, Kitboga. And if none of that sounds interesting to you, you should watch the Musora video of Ullysses Owens Jr. and his band whipping together a jazz cover of Nirvana's Heart-Shaped Box. And hell, I'll even tie it into what we're talking about today. If you want to know what expertise looks like, that's what expertise looks like. So if you're a drummer and can do what he does, if you're a bass player and can do what his bass player does, if you play the trumpet or saxophone or piano and can do what the people in that video do, then I'll call you an expert. And if you can do the equivalent in philosophy, then you're an expert. But none of us can. Because if you could, you probably wouldn't be watching this video. More on that in a second. Let's get this party started. All right, since you made it through that intro, a few things about this video that might be of interest to you. One, I just turned on a camera and rambled and ranted, and then I went back through and tried to fix things that seemed like they were egregiously crazy or didn't make a lot of sense. Me in the hat is me commenting on the original video. Because I just set things up and rambled, I'm not offering any robust, really sophisticated or thorough arguments. So if you're going to come at me, bro, I'm following advice from my comment section. Thank you. If you're going to come at me, bro, you're doing the wrong thing in the wrong place in the wrong time, because I'm not even trying to offer really robust arguments. I'm trying to touch on comments that people made and try to give people something more to think about. If a topic is interesting to you, or you want to know more about it, or you want to know why I would say the things I did and want to hear arguments about that topic, pay attention to the whole video and in the comments section say, hey, I want to see a video on this. I want to hear a full-fledged argument for this. I want to know more about this. I will put it on the list and I will likely get to it. The other thing I'm going to ask you to do is think about whether or not this format works well, or if you'd like to see maybe a live event or live stream or something where I could real-time react to people's comments or questions or concerns. Lastly, I think I have to mention, because this was just super informal, me setting up a camera and going, there's a whole lot more profanity than I would normally have in a video. And I touch on a whole bunch of topics ranging from everything from abortion to suicide bombs to the psychological harm that is so closely correlated with military service. So there's a whole bunch of topics that might not be super fun to think about. So be prepared for those. And if that's not something you want to tackle today, go watch woodturning videos. And if you continue, you'll see why I said go watch woodturning videos. All right, on to me yapping. And I had to retire my aviators and my homage to Kitboga because I need more light. I'm old, my eyes don't work. Seeing the reflection of my slide that serves as my outline and notes in the reflection of the glasses was driving me crazy. And I looked a little bit too much like someone playing a cop in a low budget 70s gay porn hanging out between takes who'd put on a hoodie to stay warm. Don't ask me why I have such a specific understanding of what it looks like on 70s gay porn set between takes. I was doing that little homage as a way to say thank you to Kit, because a handful of people mentioned that they found my videos because Kit mentioned the channel at the end of one of his Twitch streams. And I just wanted to say thanks, and I appreciate it. And I think it's cool that someone who clearly isn't going to get a damn thing out of mentioning our tiny little niche community sent people in our direction. So thank you, Kit, for that. We will return to talk a little bit more about Kit and scammers and scambaiters to illustrate a little something about the sort of moral theory that I was presenting in the video. So a good place to start with might be with the motivation behind this video and a lot of the videos that I do. People notice that The video may not have been exactly as focused on the moral argument for the existence of God as they would have thought based on the thumbnail. And I'll admit that there is a little bit of a bait and switch there. But the reason for it is I will always unapologetically point out that I'm just trying to be a teacher. I'm not an activist. I'm not trying to convince someone of the existence of God or non-existence of God. I'm not trying to convince you to become a Kantian or some flavor of Millian utilitarian. I will give the most compelling argument for Mill's attempt at a proof for the principle of utility. It's a really cool argument, and I'll present it as forcefully and vehemently as I can. And people will watch that and assume I believe in utilitarianism. Because my goal isn't and has never been to convince people of specific stuff. My goal is to present arguments and get people thinking about these things so they think better about them and challenge people's ideas. It's also something that I'm trying to figure out as I translate what I've done in the past from a classroom or an online class to this forum, because sometimes I say things and I'm a little more brusque or aggro than I should be. But all of that, whether I'm saying, oh, anybody who pretends they don't act as if they have free will is full of shit, I'm really trying to get a response. And the response is to engage someone to think more. I don't think I have it completely figured out in this venue. I was pretty good at it in a classroom and pretty good at it in an online environment. So that's what I'm doing a lot of the time. There are a handful of arguments that I will go to the mats for, but they will all have to do with specific applied ethics moral issues. I'll just tell people they're wrong if they want to argue. I'll touch on it today. People who want to argue that same-sex relationships are inherently wrong or something, or gay people are evil, I'll argue with them all day long, and I have no problem saying, yeah, there's absolutely no rational, sane, irreligious justification for the claim that gayness is wrong. It just isn't. And we can prove it. No one has a consistent, principled characterization of why they would think something like same-sex relationships are wrong. No one has a principle that they'd be willing to consistently apply. And that ties into one of the other claims that was interesting and related to this is someone had said, oh, well, you're just saying that people are bound by the principle of non-contradiction and applying it to morality. I'm paraphrasing. Yeah, that's exactly right. And someone might respond, well, what if I don't care about applying the principle of non-contradiction? That's fine. You might not care about really being accurate with regard to arithmetic when you're counting someone else's money in the way that you would be when you're counting your own. That doesn't mean that making mistakes and saying 2 + 2 = 6 isn't still wrong. Another topic that came up a bunch in the comment section is this idea that somehow the truth doesn't matter if it doesn't motivate me to act. And that's a big part of what the sorts of arguments I'm giving for foundational kind of objective accounts of morality, whether it's Kant or I'll do one soon on Mill. I'm going to do one on an interpretation of Hume's sentimentalism such that we make it something closer to an objective truth that I think people will be interested in. I'm presenting these. These arguments are attempted to get around the problems that people are mentioning. When they mention is-ought, when people in the comments are just objecting by saying, ooh, this is an is-ought fallacy. Well, prove it. That's sort of like responding when someone came and said, oh, here's the evidence that maggots or bacteria don't spontaneously generate from dirty rags. I forget the history of that stuff, but just imagine that we'll pretend that's true. And someone comes along and is like, oh, wow, look, I've got all of this evidence of these wee beastie bacteria that exist. And I've got all this evidence of how maggots come to be or bacteria come to be. And someone's like, no, just claiming, oh, you're violating is-ought is the same as me saying, no, those just come from rags. Well, all of the evidence in that case is designed to show that it doesn't come from rags. So just repeating is-ought or saying, oh, this is is-ought doesn't address the argument. It just says, oh, you're wrong because I think something else. So you got to dig in and try to, and I'm all for it. This is what I'm here for, is for people to pick apart the arguments. And I always suggest that people first and foremost try to make the argument as good as you possibly can. Try to make it so that you believe it to be true before you criticize it, and then tear it to bits, because the goal is to get smarter. I don't care if any of you are Kantians or Millians or Humeans or sentimentalists or emotivists or nihilists, really. If you're a nihilist, just stay the fuck home though, because I don't need you doing anything out in the world, committing egregious moral wrongs out in the world. The reason I'm so hard on nihilism and nihilists is it's like the result of someone who felt like they were smart or think they're smart and misread Nietzsche when they were a junior in high school. And then I'd get these like almost always a privileged white dude, almost always, who'd come into a class and think they really knew what they were talking about. They'd have to unlearn a bunch of stuff before they could effectively consider any of the other moral theories. And then if someone wants to come back to a really kind of sophisticated, enlightened version of like what ends up being a kind of virtue ethic that's motivated by psychological egoism, which is the closest anybody really ever wants to come to nihilism, that's awesome. But learn the stuff first. I know it's tempting because someone quoted "Thus spoke Zarathustra" to you, and you're like, oh, this sounds cool. And my parents really placed a bunch of arbitrary bullshit rules on me. And now I have a hammer by which to destroy all those rules, to like go off half-cocked and think this is the answer to everything. There's a whole bunch of other shit out there, and you've got to read it and consider it, then come back full circle to it. So if I'm a little rough on the nihilists, it's because I probably subconsciously am arguing with all of those dudes and trying to convince them to consider the content of the course, whatever course I'm teaching. I'm not judging y'all, and I'm not trying to convince you all. There are a handful of moral claims I'll try to convince you of, but really the goal is to get people thinking better. If you leave having watched one of my videos feeling like you learned something at all or thought a little bit differently or a little bit better about what you already believe, or you learned something new, that's what I'm trying to do. And that kind of ties into some of the expertise stuff that came up. Is I think it's awesome that a lot of people approach the comments section with a degree of humility and are saying, hey, I'm not really an expert in philosophy, or, ooh, I don't understand this stuff. Don't worry about it. None of us are experts. Nobody in the comments section of a YouTube video is an expert. I'm not an expert. Expertise in philosophy is fucking hard. People who are experts in philosophy are like grinding all the time. Like the perfect example to me is someone who like just finished their PhD, so everything they just learned is fresh in their mind. They're maybe like 3 years into their first full-time position and they're looking for that 5-year. At 5 years, they'll get reviewed for tenure. So they're on top of every argument that's coming out. Like there's new journals coming out with new research and new articles on all these topics every week. And they're staying on top of it and familiar with all of them. So if they're talking about something like is-ought, they would have been able to, off the top of their head, say, here are the latest 20 articles in the last 10 years about is-ought. And I say I'm not an expert because I've been focused on teaching philosophy for 20 years, not researching it. I know enough, like about is-ought, I can remember, it's not enough to have just read the section of the treatise where Hume mentions it, that, people often proceed as if they can generate an ought from an is, and I'm paraphrasing. To really understand it, it's like, did you read Korsgaard, what she had to say about it? How about Philippa Foot? How about there's a woman, Connor, Stephen Darwall. There are all these people, and these are just people popping into my head. I don't remember the specifics of their articles, but I know if I was going to really dig in and be an expert just in this one sentence that Hume writes in the treatise, that's what it takes. Because all of those articles, reading them, gives you a new interesting insight into it. And a lot of people want to say, well, who the fuck cares? Why is this so abstract? It's philosophy. That's awesome. It's not for you. I get it. It doesn't hurt my feelings at all. It's the same as someone who'd like 53 million people are watching woodturning videos. And they're cool. It's interesting to see someone like super glue a bunch of rolled up dollar bills together and then turn them into a knob to go on top of a banister or something. But it's not everybody's cup of tea. And I want to put something out there for the people who are willing to like dig in a little bit, try to be exposed to some more sophisticated, complicated, abstract arguments. And I'm doing my best, and I'm not perfect at it, at trying to explain the stuff in the most accessible, interesting, engaging, entertaining way I know how. And I think it's worth it because I think struggling with it is probably a little more important than spending another 15 minutes watching someone turned some glued together colored pencils into a multicolored vase. But people do that. And I'm not judging them for it. But I'm not sure as hell not going to show up in the comments section of the wood turning pages being like, this is stupid. Why are you wasting your time turning wood? Do your thing. And teaching philosophy is kind of my thing. And talking about philosophy and learning about philosophy and hopefully challenging one another to get closer to the truth is obviously the thing of a handful of people who are in the comments section. And that's rad. All right, a couple of things that already weren't terribly clear in that rant. First, the lack of confidence or the overconfidence and hubris of people with regard to how much they do or don't know in the comments section. I'm not really trying to beat up on anybody or insult anybody. The reason I care about it really is a holdover from being a teacher, which is if you're not confident enough to get into the conversation and jump in the comments, you might not get as much out of it as you could. So take a risk. And if you're so confident in your view already, like overall, I believe this worldview, then it's going to be a huge obstacle towards you really entertaining and considering views that you don't agree with, whether it's nihilism or sentimentalism or subjectivism. If you're certain you're right without having read the best arguments for the opposing views, then you're going to miss something because you're not going to read them generously or carefully or hear them generously or carefully. It's similar to like a lot of people who are the most aggressive and assertive and confident in the comments section have watched the least amount of the video, right? These are arguments that take a little time to put together. They hear one premise and they think they know what the rest of it's going to be about. And they confidently come on into the comment section without having even listened to the rest of it. And no one's paying me to teach. No one's getting a grade. I'm not trying to force anything on anyone, but just realize you're not going to learn anything if you've already made up your mind. Aaron Rodgers telling you that you should avoid vaccines because they might possibly make you sterile someday, even though there is literally no explanation as to how and why a vaccine might do this. I'm not the person telling you that, oh, global warming doesn't exist. And you don't have to trust me. If you watch enough videos, you'll figure out that I'm not going to present any arguments that absolutely suck. Just an encouraging word to say, hey, have a little bit of humility. If you're approaching this as, I'm going to prove this guy wrong and it's going to make my dick bigger because I'm going to sound so smart in the comments, I guarantee you it's not going to make any part of your anatomy bigger. And if you're someone who's struggling with the confidence to get involved in the comments, but you really want to get involved in the comments, just risk it. Remember, the people who are going to come at you the hardest, just feel sorry for them. Anybody who's going to be harsh to you in the comments section, especially in the comments section of our community. The Philosophiculist community is really pretty cool when you look at the comments compared to elsewhere. I wish I would have added a little something to the wood turning analogy that got muddled and I cut a little chunk out, which is wood turning is cool as hell. To extend the analogy, I don't show up in the comment section of wood turning videos having taken 3 wood turning classes at the rec center down the street and critique the technique of the person turning wood in the video. I might ask questions like, hey, why is it you're doing that way? But I'm not going to come in and be like, oh my God, can you believe the angle at which he's holding that knife? That's all. Hume's is may or may not be a fallacy. It really comes from an argument directed against attempts to ground morality in some sort of rational principle that one could derive from either theoretical or practical reasoning. He's just saying, hey, look, a lot of times people will somehow say, oh, well, this is the case in the world. And then somehow they proceed to, this is the way it ought to be. And I'm going to do a video very soon. Probably the next video I do will be about Hume. And 2 really cool arguments Hume gives as to how and why objective morality does not exist. And there are no objective moral facts, and it's not something we can reason our way to. It's really cool stuff. And the versions of the argument that I present are pretty compelling. It's a really important consideration in the history of philosophy. Interestingly enough, it's like Kant famously said, Hume blew his fucking mind. You can see in a way, and I think it's really helpful if you're learning this stuff or trying to learn this stuff, that Kant's whole project is a response to Hume. Is saying, holy shit, everything Hume said was so right and so good. I can't just throw it out. I've got to consider it and find a way around it. And the sort of argument or neo-Kantian version of the argument that I give and I borrow a ton from Korsgaard in order to give, is really an attempt to say, no, look, there are properties that we know exist in the world, even if we might not be able to explain everything about them, like consciousness, from which moral obligations emerge, or moral properties emerge, or moral facts emerge just from their existence. And really, that's a way to think of the argument I gave, is that the fact that there are creatures in the world who have desires and can act on those desires and reflect and want to move towards their desires, and they value the satisfaction of those desires. And then something I didn't talk nearly enough, I barely even mentioned in the video, is they also create relationships with other people who can do those same sorts of things. Just from that state of affairs emerges moral obligation and moral facts. And I think some version of that's really good and valuable and probably close to the truth. So I wanted to get that out there in order for people to start thinking about it. Again, I don't care if I convince you, but I do want you to think about it and consider it and come up with reasons and arguments for it. So is ought may be a problem for the version of the theory I gave, but the whole thing, you got to tell me where and why the problem is. Where is the problem in saying, hey, look, if I have two conscious creatures of this sort, their mere existence as conscious beings who have wants, needs, desires, feelings, thoughts, and both necessarily commit, if they necessarily commit, someone could argue this too, to acting on the principle of non-contradiction. They cannot act in the world in a way such that they reject the principle of non-contradiction. Doesn't it mean that they're contradicting themselves if they do not at least recognize the other people in the world? And I think that that's true. And you're going to come to the same, I think any rational ethical theory or metaethical theory comes to that same conclusion, which I should have talked a little bit more about. Yeah, really what I was doing in that video is like a kind of ham-fisted, oversimplified version of combo platter of metaethics, moral psychology, ethical theory. Those are all different kind of disciplines in ethics. Metaethics is to ethics as metaphysics is to physics. Metaphysics provides these kind of foundational understandings of reality and existence that physics then can use as a foundation, right? Metaphysics talks about the existence of middle-sized physical objects and the reality and existence of the world. Physics talks about how those middle-sized physical objects interact with one another, and gives us laws of gravity. Metaethics talks about the reality and existence and maybe epistemological standing of moral obligation and moral facts and stuff that's moral in the world. Is it real? Does it exist? What does it consist of? What makes it true or false? Is it something that's true or false? Ethical theory attempts to ascribe an account of here's what's right and wrong and here are the reasons for why it's right and wrong. And then applied ethics is taking the ethical theory and applying it to the world. Some people rightly picked up on the fact that I'm kind of just like glomming all of those together. And the reason I did is I just want to make the most compelling, engaging thing I can. I want something that people are willing to watch a little bit of, and I want them to leave thinking about it. Because, yeah, that's my activism, is getting people to think and reflect a little bit more. What else do I have? What else have we got? Yeah, I think that all started with, don't feel bad about not being an expert when you jump into the comments section and have a cool, thoughtful, respectful idea or question or comment or criticism. Nobody's an expert. None of the people who... The more confident someone is usually in these comment sections, the less they really know. None of the people who've come across as spectacularly confident or critical have demonstrated any sort of expertise of the sort that I mentioned. None of them are up on every article. None of them really understand all of the interpretations and conventional interpretations of is ought, if they jump in and say it. More often than not, it's someone who like heard it in another video or heard it in their intro class and is excited about it, and they have their hammer and now everything's a nail in ethics to hit with is ought or nihilism or anything else. I don't really judge either of those people, other than sometimes people who pretend to be experts feel a little bit like they're bullies and trying to bully other people. And that's just lame. Don't do that. So please, you should feel comfortable, and everybody should be approaching the comment section and everything I say and everything we all say with a degree of humility. I sure as hell try to, because it's going to, one, you're just not an expert. You aren't. If you're watching this right now and you think you're an expert, I'm telling you, you're not. Prove me wrong. Send me your CV. Send me the last 2 or 3 research papers you published, and I'll look at them. And if you really are that into proving that you're an expert in this, send me that. Give me her original arguments. Now, does that mean that having a tenure track position, having a PhD, makes it such that you know more than someone else? Of course not. But there's something kind of icky about showing up in the comments section with all of this bravado if it's an effort to shut other people down or shut other people up. If it makes you feel good, keep doing it. I'm never going to shit on you for it unless you try to shit on other people. And full disclosure, sometimes I do find it a little distasteful. And I used to find it more frustrating than I do now, because I think a lot of people think, oh, philosophy is just easy. I'll just buy a turtleneck and start smoking cloves and wear a beret, and all of a sudden I'm fucking Sartre. And it's more than that. There are people out there who are grinding, working at this stuff, reading everything, researching all of it. And you may think it's stupid. Great, don't do it. I'm not going to wood turn. But there are people who really have invested tons of time and effort and have really great ideas and understanding of really complicated abstract stuff. And it's sort of just like minimizes it in my head if someone shows up and thinks they know what the fuck they're doing when they really don't. All right. A few things. One, clearly Kant didn't say, Hume, you blew my fucking mind. But that's what he meant when he said that Hume woke him from his dogmatic slumber. That's my loose interpretation. I was feeling a little salty when I was recording all of this. The other things in there, obviously I didn't watch the how to get 10 million views in one day, Mr. Beast style videos, which that's an aside. Just because one day I Googled what an engagement metric on YouTube meant. And for the next 6 weeks, all I got recommended to me was how to make your channel grow 1 billion times in 5 days. How Mr. Beast does it. I'm going to try to do what's cool and hopefully people will watch. And if they don't, whatevs. If there's 10 of you who are interested and engaged, that's rad. And it just struck me that there's all of these videos on how to game the system, how to work the algorithm, how to make $30,000 a day using ChatGPT and no effort at all. Thankfully, I'm not in a position where that's appealing to me. But clearly, one of the ways to build your community and get more viewers isn't to insult half of them. But I'm not really insulting those of you who are watching this. I'm not insulting those of you who I've engaged in a back and forth with in the comments section. The people I'm insulting, if I'm insulting anyone at all, I'm really not trying to be mean or hurt someone's feelings. I'm just trying to maybe wake people from their dogmatic slumber a little bit by pointing out, hey, if you're going to come in and just drop a critical comment about me or the video or other people's comments and then just leave, and the goal of that comment isn't to directly challenge or make a principled objection, then seriously, just think about what are you doing? What's the purpose? Because it's clearly not to get smarter. I have absolutely no problem at all with people who are confident and have some background, and I learn from all of y'all all the time. Just the last few days I've been trying to work on this rambly mess of a video, and we'll get better at it. This one's pretty long and rambly and not so concise or clear, but the next comments on comments one will be better. But I'm thinking about how to present the basics of this sort of course guard flavored, Kantian flavored, me flavored argument that I gave in totally new and different ways, and addressing a particular concern because of the comments that I'm getting. And I was thinking about instrumental value in a totally different way because of a discussion I'm having in the comments with someone who's like, hey, I don't see why I should have the obligation. I don't see why I should care about other people's stuff. I don't see why a glass of water being valuable to me and my valuing of the properties about myself that allow me to value the glass of water means I should value those properties in anybody else. All of which are totally awesome, legitimate questions. And I'm constantly doing what I'm telling y'all you should do, which is, okay, what could this person be saying and how could I make it the most perfect criticism of the argument I presented? And is that a weakness in the argument or is that a weakness in the way I presented the argument? So if you're in the comment section and we're engaging or you're engaging with other people, please don't think I'm being critical. If you're allowing your confidence to keep you from entertaining reasonable, meaningful, thoughtful discussion because you've made up your mind already, try not to do that. But most of those people don't stick around for the comments. And most of those people sure as hell aren't watching this because they show up and oftentimes they'll make a criticism. You can see it in the comment section where people have decided what I'm going to talk about in the video before they've even watched it. In this case, there would be quite a few people who would be commenting on, who would just be assuming I'm making some kind of argument for the existence of God. Because people have this assumption, this poorly founded assumption, that the best argument for a universal moral law is some sort of divine command theory or comes from God. And that's the worst. In any intro to ethics class I've ever taught, that's one of the first things we do is make sure people realize that in analytic Western philosophy, you cannot rely on God as a premise in your argument, unless you're going to come up with an argument proving the existence of God. And regardless of what Frank Turek and William Lane Craig and all of these people think, no one's done it. No one's done it in a way that there aren't perfectly reasonable, rational objections to it. And the really great apologists and people doing philosophy of religion recognize that. So that's another rant. I'm making this video longer instead of shorter as I make these comments, but whatever. If you're still here, you're probably here for it. So onward and upward. Another philosophical objection that came up is a lot of people want to talk about evolutionary ethics. And there's really two ways to divide up evolutionary ethics. One is like research-based, descriptive flavored evolutionary ethics attempting to explain what generated our moral commitments or social behaviors and explain them in terms of like natural selection or something. Cool. Interesting. But that doesn't tell us anything necessarily about what we ought to do or what the right thing to do is. And it's probably totally irrelevant unless you can show that we're incapable of doing anything but what we've been somehow biologically programmed to do. And that's going to be a tough sell because you look at the complexity and variation of behaviors between human beings. Anybody can turn out to be just about anything individually. So the descriptive flavors of just saying, hey, it seems like we might have developed this prohibition against this particular behavior because it would have increased cooperation. And as the sort of communities our species would have had at the time, cooperation would have been really highly valued. Therefore, that's how we came to have a prohibition against murdering each other. Cool. That's interesting. That doesn't tell me if murder's right or wrong. It just explains how we came to have some of those beliefs, not whether we should have those beliefs, right? Natural inclination isn't necessarily good justification for a particular action. I might have to pee really, really badly. Doesn't mean in the middle of class I would have just like started to pee on the floor. Because socialization or our own social pressures or understanding or arguments or ideas or beliefs can overcome those physical desires. And that's a kind of a trivial example, but even if it's the case that just these arguments and discussions and thinking about right and wrong serve as a cause for us to behave in certain ways, there's an argument to be made that that's worth it and justifies it. Saying that something provided some sort of evolutionary advantage with regard to natural selection, and so that's why we are programmed to have that behavior, sure as hell doesn't say it's a good behavior to have. The normative sorts of this evolutionary ethic, where people would be saying, oh, because this would lead to survival, you should do it. That's exactly the sort of thing that Hume and G. Moore were pointing out are the result of the is-ought or the naturalistic fallacy. Just because it seems like people are programmed or to survive or tend to want to preserve their survival doesn't mean survival is inherently valuable and that we should pursue it. There are plenty of people who will make pretty damn compelling arguments as to how maybe the best thing that could happen for the earth would be maybe human animals going extinct could be the best thing for the planet. If one were to want to argue that other sorts of organisms or beings or conscious beings have a certain sort of moral standing. Don't take that in any way, shape, or form to say that I believe that human beings should go extinct. I'm just saying there's arguments to point out that survival isn't in and of itself intrinsically valuable. Plenty of people have really good arguments to say, I don't have a life worth living anymore, right? Really sick, struggling, suffering, terminally ill people might be totally justified in killing themselves, ending their survival before they're able to reproduce. So we need an argument. If we were going to say survival is valuable, most people would want to say, yeah, we can say that because people value their own survival, not because survival in and of itself should determine or dictate what we do. And those discussions of kind of evolutionary ethics have been tied in the comment section a lot to sort of teleological considerations. And teleology or teleological just refers to any kind of purposeful explanation or purposeful something. So to say an ethical theory was teleological would be saying that it relied on fulfilling a purpose, or a teleological account of the metaphysics of the world would be one that relied on the existence of things in the world being purposeful. More often than not, ever since, at least Aquinas, but even really before that, after people plugged God into Aristotle's naturalism and his teleological account, most of those sorts of arguments that are going to talk about the world as being purposeful will rely on God having given everything in the world its purpose. But ever since, Darwin, a lot of people, particularly those who commit to science, are going to say, yeah, there are no purposes in the world other than the purposes that we give the world. Conscious beings create the purposes of the world. They're not inherent in nature. Nature just happened. I mean, that was the big challenge. That's a big reason Darwin screwed everything up, is we have this really great, thorough explanation of how biological complexity and all of these things that we attributed to fulfillment of God's purpose, or there needing to be a designer who gave things its purpose based on Aristotle's theory of causes. And Darwin shows up and is like, no, that shit can just happen. And he has this unbelievably cool, interesting explanation of it. And then we plug in like some basic Mendelian genetics into that picture, and it's like, holy shit, the account of natural selection is good. All of which gets us what we have in the universe without purposes. So any ethical theory that really relies on inherent natural purposes has a huge uphill battle in an attempt to justify the existence of those purposes and say, purposes aren't just the result of creatures like us valuing something and wanting to pursue it. Sure, the universe has purposes in it because people give things those purposes. A rock on the ground doesn't have a purpose until someone picks it up and uses it as a tool or throws it. So I think that covered the evolutionary biology stuff, the natural selection stuff, and some teleology stuff. A couple of things worth clarifying from that section. One, I am sure someone's already worked up thinking, ooh, but the reason you don't pee on the floor in the classroom is because we put social pressures to keep people from peeing on the floor, because if everybody just peed on the floor, then it would risk increasing disease and that would lead to us being less likely to survive. That wasn't the point of that example. The point of that example was to say, here's a clear example of where things we presumably get to choose decide on whether or not someone should exercise a particular natural, basic physical desire or not. We have some degree of control, it seems, over that. We get to choose whether or not to do that, choose to make that a social pressure. And so saying that some biological drive is just inherently normative, that the fact that we have the drive means we ought to follow it, is that violation of both, kind of in a way, Hume's ought and Moore's naturalistic fallacy, which I cut out a chunk where I started to explain it and I didn't do a good job. More's naturalistic fallacy is basically, he argues that anybody ascribing right and wrong or trying to derive right and wrong from any sort of natural property. So if this was like a conception of flourishing or survival or anything that's a naturalistic account in the world, and the naturalistic fallacy may not be a fallacy, but he's just saying it will always be reasonable for someone to object to whatever natural property you come up with. If you say survival, if you say really great examples that illustrate the weakness of these sorts of arguments have to do with like sex or gender or sexual preference / orientation. Maybe I'll even do a video as to why I think everybody should say sexual preference instead of sexual orientation. Right? Those arguments are all bad, right? Like if someone's like, clearly illustrate how is-ought and naturalistic fallacy works. Oh, well, most folks with certain genetic makeup tend to act this way, and therefore they should act this way with regard to gender, and whether they have XY or XX sex chromosomes determines how they should act. That's bananas. That's a horrendous argument. The fact that in general, historically, women have been caregivers or responsible for reproductive labor doesn't mean that any individual woman ought to do that. The fact that historically, biologically, dudes have been responsible for whatever, hunting, gathering, and providing doesn't mean that all dudes ought to do that. Those are the sorts of examples that illustrate the naturalistic fallacy, like, oh, but it and is ought. Well, it seems like most women have performed these duties, therefore they should. That's the dumbest shit ever, and we have 1,000 arguments against it, more than thousands, millions, of all of the women you know who are horrendous caregivers. Just evil, cold-hearted, horrible humans who make terrible mothers, and some of y'all have been traumatized by them. Similarly, you've got lots of dudes who are totally not cut out to be the breadwinner or provider or go out and be the whatever in the world, but they might make much better parents. That could be an interesting topic to do too. I'm definitely going to do something on gender soon. So those illustrate, right? If you're going to say because something is the case, therefore it ought to be the case, you need a really great argument for it. Hume wasn't saying, and if you're going to say, well, naturally or biologically or evolutionarily, this means good, you're going to need a really huge argument for that. I think that's all I needed to do other than to give you another chance to look at my stupid hat and my stupid face. The most important stuff in this long-ass rant and rambly sort of informal discussion is how much of an oversimplification I gave of the conception of personhood and how relationships between persons could generate moral obligation, and how the psychological faculties I was trying to explain that might be required to value something like water and people having them could be seen as collectively sufficient or individually necessary for moral agency, personhood, or moral value. Now, those are a lot of rambly words, but it's basically me saying, hey, look, creatures like the ones I described, it's a lot more complicated than just trying to start that discussion by talking about, hey, if you value water, you value yourself. And if you value yourself, you're contradicting yourself if you don't consider everybody else to be valuable too. But that's the sort of principle I wanted to focus on to get people thinking about. And a lot of people, again, it's interesting that some people were like, oh, well, you're just trying to say that contradictions are false, but why should I value that? Well, I don't care whether you personally value it, the same way I don't care whether you personally value being wrong about 2 + 2 = 5. The point of the argument is to say that you're making a factual error. Whether you care about it or not is irrelevant. The fact that it is about value and it doesn't matter, its truth value is not contingent in any way about your caring about it, is the demonstration of how it might be able to get around the is-ought problem. But the big mistakes I gave, I wish I would have focused more on how and why people create valuable and meaningful and obligatory relationships with other people. Our identity is a hugely important part to some of the course guards' arguments. And here's me coming clean. Like, I'm not an expert. I haven't read anything of hers in 25 years. And she's done a ton of work. And I've just barely skimmed a couple of things because I've been focused on teaching. And I'm not teaching a whole lot of course guard to intro classes. But I want to teach a little bit of it because, this is again tangential, I want to teach a little bit of it because the coolest stuff I ever encountered was in graduate school. And what you learn in an intro class or a high school class regarding Kant or Hume or Mill or any of these arguments oftentimes is just enough to be dangerous, like to get it wrong. And the most interesting stuff you don't learn until you really dig in. And that's part of the challenge of why I think I screwed things up in the explanation of personhood, is I'm wanting to take these kind of what I think to be cooler, more interesting, maybe more sophisticated, more challenging, robust interpretations of particular theories, because I think they're better. And I want to bring some of that cool stuff that happened in graduate seminars to people who've never really thought about or talked about philosophy anymore, because it's the coolest stuff. And sometimes stuff gets lost in the shuffle. And with regard to the nature of how and why, the psychological faculties of reflective awareness, being able to have intentions as a result of our being conscious, consciousness in and of itself as awareness, and being subjects as having a point of view, even distinguishing something a ton of people continue to either disagree with me about and not be able to explain why they disagree, or are just getting wrong, is saying something subjective means, when we say it's mind independent, it means the truth value of the statement is mind independent, not that no one can ever think of it. If we said everything is subjective as soon as someone thinks of it, then everything would be subjective. That we think of it doesn't necessarily change the truth value of it or make it so that it's no longer something that is true or false. Like I said, I explained in that chocolate and tar example, right? When we're saying something subjective, that a subject believes it doesn't necessarily make it subjective. Whether or not a subject's particular point of view changes the content and or the truth value or truth valuability of the claim is what makes it subjective, right? 3 is greater than 2. Objective, because anybody who understands those words, those concepts, based on our fundamental understanding and our language with talking about math, understands that those concepts are related to one another in that way, regardless, whether one subject's thinking about it or none subjects are thinking about it. That's what we're going for if we're going to say that you have to treat all people, including yourself, and consider them all as valuable as persons, even if you're going to be treating them as instrumentally valuable as things. It's really just saying, recognize the fact that they're conscious beings who have wants, needs, desires, and they value stuff too. So if you're going to fuck with their program, you damn sure better consider that first. That's a relational property in the same way. The goal is to say that claim doesn't change. The truth value of that claim, it's true or false, regardless of who's thinking about it. Period, full stop. You're ignoring a fact about the world that's meaningfully relevant if you fuck with someone else, harm someone else, exploit someone else, take advantage of someone else, use someone else, without considering that they're a person who's capable of having and pursuing and valuing stuff in the world. And the part I really would have liked to have talked more about is that Course Guard talks about with regard to identity is like identifying oneself as a particular, having a certain sort of identity, whether it's me as a teacher or father or brother or son or friend. Each of those carries with them certain obligations because they describe certain sorts of relationships I've entered into with other people. So as a teacher, I had an obligation. As the sort of YouTuber that I think I am, I have an obligation. I am trying to produce the most engaging, interesting stuff that I think will get people to think and create value and maybe think better about stuff in the world, whether it has to do with ethics or math or God or the external world. Who knows what topics we'll cover. I've created those commitments to other people. I've decided what sort I want to be. and I have a relationship with you. And it's certainly, we're using each other, right? But I'm never going to forget that you're a person too, who has wants and needs and desires, and has a network of caring relationships that are important to you and are important to the people who have that relationship or those relationships with you. And I'm never going to see you just as clicks or views or subscribers, because one, I'm lucky enough to have had a background such that I could never not see you all as people. But I also think it's tremendously wrong. Whether I'm seeing you just as a click or a view or a subscriber or money or anything else, I'm making a mistake because I'm failing to consider all of the other stuff you might have going on. Whether or not you had a shitty day, whether or not you're in a shitty relationship, whether or not you're happy as a clam, whether you have all the free time in the world or no free time in the world. Maybe some of your attitudes towards philosophy come from the fact that you had a shitty philosophy teacher, which almost all shitty attitudes towards philosophy, if someone took a class in philosophy, it comes from having had a bad teacher. It's why I so desperately badly don't want to be a bad teacher. I don't want to turn people off to it. You have things going on in your life. You have people who rely on you. You rely on other people. All of those things are just facts about the world. And if I fail to consider them, then I'm doing something morally wrong. All right, a couple of things that might have been misleading in that last section. I got to jump in on myself. It's like I'm playing Uno. I made it sound like I'm a way better person than I am. Of course, I think everybody, is not taking into account everybody's personhood all the time, everywhere. I am sometimes thinking of you just as clicks or as a pain in the ass in the comments, or someone who's really awesome and providing a really cool, challenging, interesting idea or challenge for me to crack the code to help you learn something in the comments. But if I ever find myself treating you as less than a person, or behaving in such a way, or responding in such a way, or being motivated or trying to make a video in such a way that compromises your personhood, then I'm trying to reflect on that and be like, oh man, I shouldn't do that next time. But everybody in the moment fails to consider everybody else's personhood at times. And that's just part of the human condition. And so it's one of the things that I really wish I would have mentioned more, is a lot of people interpret certain sorts of Kantian stuff as being like a decision-making procedure. Like, I've got to figure out what action in this moment does it. That's not the way people work. If that's the way Kant wanted it to work, his theory's stupid in that regard. What it is it gives us this criteria or measuring stick that at the end of the day, when we're reflecting, we could say, man, I wish I would have done that better. Or when we're feeling guilty about something, we can say, should I feel guilty about that or not? Or when we're trying to figure out the right thing to do, or the right person to become, or what sort of traits or habits we want to cultivate, we can say, damn, was I respecting people? Was I living up to the identity I've created? Was I living up to my obligations as a fellow human, or a fellow citizen, or a fellow family member, or a fellow classmate, or a teacher, or a parent, or a husband or wife, or mother or daughter? That's what this stuff is about. Not in the moment, let me figure out if I should run into the street and pull that child from in front of the oncoming bus. Because that's crazy. No one does that. That wouldn't work. That's not a thing. So yes, I made it. I hope I didn't come across, but it might have come across as if I was saying like, yes, I'm consciously considering every human being on the planet all the time, everywhere. I'm not. Probably doing too much of that. Thanks, anxiety. But it's more than enough to be at the end of the day saying, what can justify the way I treated myself and the other people that I'm interacting with? I think that's an important piece of this sort of moral puzzle, and how to approach ethics well is like really looking at yourself in the mirror and saying, wow, can I become a better person? And that struggle may be all there is. I really think it probably is that that's the best people can do, is to constantly try to improve and be okay with that improvement and then feel good about that improvement. I don't want to mislead anybody into thinking that it could come across, and depending on who you are and what you're looking for in your life, I don't have a personal relationship in a sense with any of you. I don't know any of you beyond the comments section. We're not close personal friends. I'm not a shoulder to cry on. I shouldn't be providing any kind of psychological need in your life other than, oh, this is cool to watch these YouTube videos and learn something from them. And I say that because I worry about it because I think it's possible for people to replace real world relationships with ones they imagine are happening with someone on a computer screen or a phone screen or at the head of a class. So can't even tell you how much I appreciate all y'all who are watching a video, especially like this. But yeah, I'm just a dude in a box, right? And at some point, I'll probably make a video explaining why I would say that sort of thing. It's something I've been thinking about because of some of the discussion in the comment section that I wanted to add to is that idea of subjectivity that I think a lot of people have where they're like, ooh, if a subject thinks of it, then the claim is necessarily subjective, is just using the term in a really odd way. It's really something closer to like a combo platter of some kind of radical Berkeleyan idealism where you're saying all that exists in the world are ideas, coupled with like some super radical solipsism, like the only world that exists is my world. So wherein someone says, oh, well, as soon as someone's thinking of the idea of a unicorn, it exists and it's as real and true and valuable and has the same epistemic status as the claim 2 + 2 = 4 because both of them are being thought of by subjects. Therefore, they're both subjective. And that's kind of the logical conclusion of the sort of argument I feel like some people are making when they're like, everything's subjective because subjects think of it. That would be a really, really, really hard position to defend. So keep that in mind. Could be something people want to talk about more in the future. And I think that's it for that section, which ties in nicely to some of the other stuff I wanted to talk about with regard to personhood. Really can come through best when we apply the theory a little bit. And since I said we were going to talk about scammers and scambaiters, it really ties into an example that came up in the comments a few times. Is Kant famously wrote a paper on of the supposed right to lie from either beneficent, philanthropic, or altruistic motives, depending on your translation, where he said, right, like it'd be wrong to lie to a murderer. Like, let's say you're in this room with me and I run out one door and then you notice a dude with a chainsaw comes in the door and is like, where did that fucker go? I want to kill him. Kant argued that it would still be wrong to lie to him. Now, Kant wouldn't prohibit you from staying silent and saying, hey, I'm not going to tell you, even if the dude said, I'm going to kill you. Because sometimes it's hard to do the right thing. And people want to say, well, what the hell? That's insane. And I'll agree with them. I think Kant was wrong. Because I don't think you're violating the murderer at the door by lying to them because they've already violated themselves. If one of the chief reasons we don't treat other people in shitty ways is we don't want to contradict ourselves because we find ourselves as persons to be valuable. The murderer with the chainsaw and the ski mask and the I'm going to murder you has already removed themselves from that level of consideration. They're no longer persons. They're not reflecting. They're not acting rationally. They're not considering other people. Therefore, I have less of an obligation to them. So I'm okay with lying to the murderer at the door. An example that people have given to illustrate this sort of problem for Kant, but I think illustrates the sort of solution that I advocate for, is what if you're hiding Anne Frank? What if the Nazis come to the door and are like, hey, do you have a family of Jews behind your bookshelf? Does that mean you can't lie to the Nazi? My argument is, hell no. You absolutely can lie to that Nazi. Lie your face off to the Nazi if you think you can get away with it. By wearing the jackboots and the Sig Heiling up and down the street and the swastika and the uniform, that person's already designated themselves as less than someone who's acting fully rationally with full humanity and full personhood. They've diminished themselves. We don't have to treat them in this way that demands that they can be considered as a valuable thing that's the source of all value because their goal is to compromise value. Right? Kant would say, well, I'm depriving them of their personhood because what if I lied to them and then because of my lie, they doubled back around and ended up finding the Frank family anyway? Well, I know I can't control the consequences, but my intention there isn't to undermine someone's personhood, but minimize the compromise of someone's person. And so I think that sort of explanation illustrates how and why this moral law, this really metaethical foundational principle, can be applied in kind of nuanced ways. It's why I would argue scammers who are attempting to exploit people, particularly people who are usually pretty vulnerable, who might be older or lonely, or just from socialization be committed to really being polite and nice and thoughtful and listening, and might not understand technology in the best of ways. Hell, I'm already there. I'm already old, such that my understanding of technology is pretty crappy. And people are trying to take advantage of them, to exploit them, to use them without recognizing their full-fledged personhood. That these are people with lives and values and things that are important to them. And that these people are important to other people and they have meaningful relationships that matter. And they ignore that. It's why people say, when someone's objectified, right? Like it's wrong to objectify someone. Yeah, because you're treating someone who's a subject as an object. That's a mistake. That's just a factual error. If I'm treating the person on the phone as if they're my personal ATM and I'm going to exploit them and take advantage of them and I'm going to steal all of Claire Huxtable's money until Jason Statham comes and ties me to a pickup truck and sends me into the river. If anybody saw that movie. They're saying my wants, needs, and desires are inherently and necessarily more important than yours. And the only reason for that is I'm me and you're you. But that's not a principle anybody can apply consistently, because you know who can say I'm me and you're you? Everybody. And there's no meaningful difference, right? It's that contradiction of if two things are the same in the meaningfully relevant ways, then they need to be treated the same, whether it's a quantity or whether it's a person. Because no one's going to say, it's a comment that comes up, 2 + 2 = 4, whether I'm counting apples or whether I'm counting oranges. If part of what makes me valuable is the fact that I value things and I enjoy satisfying my desires and valuing them, that's what makes it valuable, that I value things and have desires and satisfy them. The particulars of the desires are irrelevant. That I want someone's money that I'm going to try to scam and take advantage of and use doesn't make it any less true that they're valuable and I'm treating them as if they're not. And it ties into why, and I can tell you, I hate pranks. I hate prank phone calls, and videos about pranks usually just make me cringe. I couldn't watch like all of a teen movie when in the 80s, because I'd always be covering my ears and eyes, because anytime someone's going to embarrass themselves, like, oh gosh, I know she's going to ask this guy out and he's the popular guy and he's going to shit on her, oh, or vice versa, or I knew someone was going to do something really embarrassing, drove me crazy. Hate it. I'm not going to seek out Kit's videos. I have watched a few in the last day since he was kind enough to give us a little shout out. And he's pretty hilarious. And he's really thoughtful and good at improv based on what he's getting from the people. So it's kind of really fun to watch. But what makes it fun to watch? How can I say that it's okay for him to do something that I don't like to see? It makes me uncomfortable. Well, because the people he's scamming, the people he's pranking, they deserve it. They've removed themselves from full-fledged moral consideration by doing wrong things, by being people who will take advantage of other people and treating people like shit. And if anything, just as a practical consequence, this dude comes along, keeps them on the phone for an hour, and that's an hour they're not spending stealing someone else's money. Maybe they've learned something. He's exploiting the shit out of the situation. He's using those people to make some money, to put them on the Twitch stream, taking advantage of that situation, and he should. And it's morally justified. Because the people who are the victims of his pranks are people who otherwise have demonstrated that they're willing to do wrong things. They're willing to minimize their own personhood by taking advantage and exploiting all sorts of people. Not just the direct victims of their financial scammery, but all the people in relationships with those people. So yeah, even though, perfect example for those who are like, oh, but it's all just subjective and it's based on feelings. My feelings in general about prank phone calls But morally, with regard to what Kit's doing, fucking rad. Do more of it. I'm going to have to sub to his Twitch stream. See me in the chat. Thanks, Funkulist, for the 26 months. I don't know if that's how Twitch streams even work anymore. But that's cool as hell. So the real important stuff that I want to make sure comes through from that last little rambly section is that one of the things that Kant would have said you're depriving of the murderer at the door is the opportunity for them to redeem themselves. Or in the Nazi case, it would be the opportunity for them to redeem themselves and do the right thing. I can't control that. All I can control is my own stuff, so I'm not going to lie to them. Or if it was examining like the scam bait or examining what Kit's doing, someone might say, well, you're not giving the scammer the opportunity to do better. And particularly in Kit's case, which is so cool about it, is the people he's scamming are in the act of trying to scam him. He's undermining their actual attempts to scam him, right? He's pretending to be someone scammable and wasting their time and creating entertainment and informing people of the sorts of things scammers try to do all at the same time, which is what totally justifies it. And the real point I was trying to make is I can say it's cool, it's awesome, and he ought to do it, even though it's not my cup of tea, demonstrating that this sort of argument gives me good justification to say, yeah, that's okay, that's right or wrong, regardless of my personal subjective preferences. So back to me yapping before I yap some more about me yapping. So one thing that I really want to differentiate is, rightly, a lot of people object to equating people who have chosen, who have the capacity for rationality or reflection or whatever else, and choose to not utilize it or recognize the moral obligation they have to other people, versus those who might have varying degrees of the psychological capacities I talked about, reflective consciousness, rationality, whatever else. And first and foremost, remember, rationality, what we're talking about, we're not talking about anything complex. All that is required is recognizing contradictions are false. If I come to you and I say, the statement, my name is Steve, is true, and the statement, it is not the case that my name is Steve, is true, you know they both can't be true. That's it. That's all we're asking. So it's not some complex, theoretical, abstract, critical thinking that's demanded. And people have varying degrees of reflective awareness and varying degrees of rationality. But all we're asking for is the capacity for that, and that people do their best. It's one of the things about this theoretical sort of approach is taking the theory, and when you apply it to the real world, it never applies perfectly. It's sort of like truths of math. Like, how often are you going to find a perfect isosceles triangle out in the world? Probably never, because theoretically it's going to be really hard to get all the angles and all the sides right. But that doesn't mean we can't make a triangle. Similarly, we have this general idea, treat each other and ourselves with respect, and probably the best we can do is strive to do our best to do that. What's the minimum requirement of those faculties such that someone demands moral consideration? Well, I'm going to say consciousness. I just had a flashback to before I got really, really sick last year and had to end making videos for a little while. I had done a series of 3 videos on abortion. And the comment section was crazy because you talk about people who are confident in what they believe, even though what they believe fails to consider 99% of the research ever done on the topic that they're talking about. It's abortion prohibitionists. People were coming confident, like, well, you can't talk about consciousness as an argument with regard to a zygote because we don't know anything about consciousness. Like, no, we know a lot about consciousness. We know that we have never seen a case and have no possible explanation of how and why a zygote could be conscious. Unless you're going to rely on something like magic or ensoulment. And even historically, traditional accounts of ensoulment in the Christian tradition are going to say it happens way later than the moment of conception. But yeah, we know that 2 cells coming together doesn't make the thing conscious. Well, what do you mean by consciousness? We can't even explain it or say, yeah, we can. I'll just borrow, as I did in the videos, from Nagel. It's a really great learning tool, is the argument he gives. He wrote a paper called What It's Like to Be a Bat that has really interesting, cool consequences for philosophy of mind. But the thing I borrow from it is what it's likeness If there's something you can say that it's like to be a thing, it's conscious and a subject. If there's nothing that it's like to be, then it's an object. There is something that it's like to be a bat, to be flying around and echolocating. There is something like that it is to be a dog. If you were a dog, had a dog brain, dog experiences, there's something it's like. A rock, nothing that it's like to be. A zygote, nothing that it's like to be. Now, that doesn't mean that I'm saying that all abortions are right or all abortions are wrong. Consciousness and awareness, we know a lot about it. Hell, it's been 25 years probably since we could identify a Halle Barry neuron, right? People can know that you are consciously aware of or are currently considering or thinking about Halle Barry. Whether or not it's her face, her name, you would recognize her in a crowd by looking at what particular neurons firing in your brain. That's how much we know about the connection between brains and consciousness. And we know far more than that. But it's not like this stuff's totally a mystery. Some of it's mysterious, but not all of it. So that's where I'd begin. Everything that's conscious demands moral consideration. Not everything that's conscious will demand particular sorts of moral consideration, hence my putting a cat in the cat carrier argument, right? Different cognitive abilities, different levels of consciousness, different flavors of consciousness, all might require different specific moral obligations. That doesn't necessarily mean less or more or fewer. And I think there's a really, really important comment that someone made about autism. And I should have been way more careful. And I really was trying to be, but I wasn't enough. Because historically, people have talked about people with cognitive differences or disabilities or mental infirmities, or even folks who are deaf or blind, have talked about them as being less than persons. And that's the most fucked up thing in the world. That's the last thing you want. Or black or brown people or women historically, right? Like women aren't fully rational, therefore they're not full-fledged persons. Those are arguments people made. That has nothing to do with anything I'm ever presenting. Because I want to say you have to consider, start with, is it conscious? And then work your way up from there, figuring out, okay, in what ways is it conscious? And then I start to think about what obligations might I have to it. So just a real quick thing to try to super duper reinforce something that I brought up in this little section, which is, one, we have to realize that no one's ever going to be a perfect person, and no one's ever perfectly exercising their perfect capacities of rationality or reflective awareness or treating themselves or everybody else with dignity and respect all the time everywhere. But that doesn't mean we ought not try. The other part of it is, and it may be the most important thing to reinforce in here, is saying that everything that's morally wrong is morally wrong because it violates a person in some way is in no way, shape, or form intended to attempt to draw a line of moral value or moral consideration between people with certain psychological capacities and those who don't have those psychological capacities. I do believe that everybody and everything that has any sort of consciousness as awareness. Someone's probably nitpicking about the way I talked about consciousness and being like, well, there are certain functionalist sorts of accounts that would say a zygote is conscious, but those will also say a light switch is conscious. I'm talking about having some sort of phenomenal consciousness, subjective awareness, having a point of view, experiencing the world, because that's the morally relevant part for this discussion. Anybody who's trying to demean or consider conscious beings and treating them as things that aren't conscious beings is making a mistake. And the specifics of the obligations we have to varying flavors of conscious beings depends. So that's really all I was trying to say. It's just, it would really frustrate me if someone were to try to take what I said and then treat some conscious beings as less than just based on the idea, well, they're not persons. No, you got to do more than that. You got to do more than that. So I had to clarify that. I had to reinforce that idea. This last section illustrates something too about when people roll into the comments hard and like drop a one-line criticism that clearly had nothing to do with the whole video. Imagine how many things I said in that last section, including, well, women aren't fully rational. They don't deserve full moral consideration or whatever I said. If you took that out of context, you have no idea what the argument was about. You have no idea that I was saying that in order to show how ridiculous and stupid it is. So if you're going to really try to get something out of these videos or any book you're reading or video you're watching or argument you're hearing, you probably ought to listen to the whole thing if you're going to form an opinion about it or have it inform the way you view anything in the world. That's all until next time. Oh, I was going to use the example to illustrate how and why one's particular subjective desires are irrelevant to the moral rightness or wrongness of something, given this view. And I was going to use same-sex relationships because whether you're gay or not, it doesn't matter. There's no rational argument, even if I'm just like grossed out. I'm one of those people who are like, ooh, gross, two dudes kissing, bleh. That has nothing to do with my ability to recognize that two consenting adults having a same-sex relationship, there's nothing conceivably morally wrong about that inherently. Nothing. There's no consistent rational principle someone can come up with to say how and why same-sex relationships are wrong. Even if the same-sex relationships are taking place in a low-budget gay porn where I'm playing a cop in 1974. Okay, there might be something morally wrong about that for other reasons. There might be something aesthetically wrong with that, but maybe not morally wrong. Right? What principled, non-contradictory argument could you give as to why that's wrong and a reason why it's wrong? That's why I'll probably have to do a video on, I forget who it is. Really great arguments pointing out that arguments against homosexuality, like on the grounds that it's unnatural or something, are all terrible because they are. But right, like even if it grosses me out, even if I hate it, even if I have no desire to get it on with a dude, I can absolutely still fully and completely and rationally commit to the notion that anybody who wants to have gay sex should be having all the gay sex they want. There's nothing inherently wrong with gay sex that couldn't possibly be wrong with heterosexual relationships, right? My particular preferences are irrelevant. I might love chocolate cream pie. That doesn't mean I should make a law saying everybody should have chocolate cream pie. That's what it would be like to have a subjective law because it would be based on my subjective preferences. I might hate chocolate cream pie and recognize everybody should have access to chocolate cream pie because I like to eat whatever sort of dessert I like. And the reason I would say I want to respect and support people who are pursuing their own desires to have intimate, loving, caring, adult, consenting sexual relationships with whoever the hell they want to is because I recognize that that's a valuable thing. And what makes it valuable is having the relationship with the person you want to have the relationship with. That's why, I don't know if you remember, people used to, yeah, gay dudes can marry all the people they want as long as they're women. Ha ha ha. They have the same rights to get married as I do. Well, that's the dumbest shit ever. Because the right that was being protected with regard to legal marriage is extending legal protections to all of those loving, caring, intimate, committed relationships that were with people one wanted to have a relationship with. So that's a perfect example that illustrates when people are saying subjective, that's what subjective's meaning in the argument that I'm presenting and how I'm defining it for the purposes of this argument. You're going to have to come up with a really different and what I would say is very unconventional definition of subjective, because clearly my subjective preference is totally irrelevant. The truth of the statement, it's only fair to have legal marriage for same-sex couples in the same way that we have legal protections for heterosexual couples. Like that statement is true or false regardless of how I feel about same-sex relationships. Some other examples, because they're ripped from the headlines. I'm like a Law and Order episode. Is Law and Order still on every channel? But think about why it's wrong. All of the things that might be going wrong with regard to dude in New Orleans driving his car into a crowd of people and trying to blow up more and having a shootout with the cops, right? Every one of those people he's seeing as a means to his end, whether it's an end for political gain or an end for personal satisfaction or to satisfy some sort of delusional belief he might have had about what the spiritual or moral or political consequences of his action were going to be. He was using them. Because if he was considering all of them and all of the value that each and every one of them have in the world, then he's probably not going to do it. And some people are going to be like, well, sometimes you have to fight wars. Yeah, sometimes you do. Kant argued that all wars would say that, he argued for perpetual peace, which might be the sane, rational thing to do, but it's probably totally impractical. That dude's personhood was compromised. As soon as he gets into that car and decides that he's going to run into a bunch of people and try to kill as many people as possible to prove a point, he's compromised his own personhood. He's doing something wrong. If and when dude straps himself to that Tesla, shoots himself, and then blows it up, making a statement, whatever his political statement was, he's defiling and debasing and using himself. What is it about military service and the lifestyle and the training and what we're encouraging people to do, particularly if they're combat veterans, that leads to their having really profound mental problems, struggling so much and having such spectacularly higher suicide rates, depression rates, divorce rates, struggling with relationships? And what ought we do if people are genuinely wanting to celebrate and wave flags on Veterans Day and really, woo, go veterans? Are we giving and committing the resources and energy and time and money to really recognizing, holy shit, part of the training, when someone's making the ultimate sacrifice to join the military, it might not be that the ultimate sacrifice is their death. It's they're handing over their personhood as soon as they enter and the training begins. It might be something necessary, and it might be something super heroic and noble to do, but not heroic in a, woo, let me wave the flag, I'm going to go be a hero and kick ass and take names, but in a, I'm decreasing the probability that I'm really going to be able to come back and be a functioning, thoughtful, loving, caring, happy member of society, because what I'm signing up for is going to be pretty fucking miserable in a lot of ways. So when are we willing to, rather than like give lip service to go veterans, how about really putting our money and time and resources where our mouth is and saying, holy shit, we are asking these people to do things to themselves and other people that are horrific, that have tremendously shitty consequences. And we should really be supporting them and providing all of the resources that we possibly can for their mental and physical health, and doing far more than just waving a flag a couple of days a year, thanking them for their service, buying them a beer, and saying, rah, rah, go USA. Maybe we ought to do more than that because we've asked them to violate their own personhood. All right, a few things to mention about that little rant. The same-sex relationship stuff is very similar to the gender stuff. It's like if someone were to say, ooh, well, all humans born with XX ought to be mothers, ought to be good and caring, ought to live this sort of life. Well, if I'm forcing them to do that or coercing them to do that, the same way if I was coercing someone who wanted to have a same-sex relationship because it violated some expectation I created, then I'm compromising their ability to pursue their desires, to reflect on their own wants, needs, and desires and make rational choices, to pursue the sort of life they want to live, to satisfy those desires, all of which are totally rational. For a woman to say, yeah, I don't want to be a caregiver. I don't want to be a mom. The same way we ought to be able to say, yeah, if you want to do that, rad. And it illustrates some of what I'm talking about with regard to identity and relationships when we say, hey, two people should come together as parents and decide who's best, what's going to be best to provide the best resources for a child. Because like I mentioned before, the fact is some women suck at parenting, absolutely terrible at it. That they have boobs and could breastfeed is irrelevant because they're shitty at being parents. There's also some dudes who are the last people you want to go out and slay dragons and provide. That doesn't make them bad people. It just means they fail to live up to a relatively arbitrary, socially constructed idea of what a dude should do that does have some basis in biology, but that's all generalization anyways. So let me know if you want to hear more of a video about that. I'm definitely doing one, whether you want to or not, because I think it's cool and interesting. But if there's more interesting stuff in there you want, let me know. And my rant about patriotism and the way we treat veterans is rooted in just a frustration and inconsistency that I see all the time. And it's a really great example of like the most extreme case of treating someone as if they're a thing and not a person versus treating them both as a thing and a person. Because if you're signing up for the military and recognizing I'm going into combat and I'm recognizing this is going to have profound effects on me emotionally, mentally, physically, that might make it all but impossible for me to live the sort of white picket fence life that a lot of people imagine is the right of every American, but I'm willing to do it anyways. And I'm going to suffer with that and struggle with that and deal with it. And I know it going in and I still sign up for it. Then it makes sense. They're recognizing and agreeing to be treated as a thing. And if someone sends them into harm, whoops away. And if someone sends them into harm's way or asks them to do these things that are going to have these profound consequences on who they are and the life they can end up living, and that's one thing. But for a lot of people, it's a case of a bunch of kids who have romanticized ideas about what it means to be in the military. And they're really going into the military because they don't really have any other options. They think they're going to come out the other side to a parade and being thought a hero and super badass. And it's like out of a movie. And everybody loves them and life is candy and roses. And they get a tattoo and drink beer. And then we're misleading them. So they're not able to make a rational, reflective, thoughtful, conscious decision. And then when they return and it turns out that they didn't get exactly what they thought they were going to get, we just abandon them and don't support them. And we don't help them regain their personhood and try to do everything we can to provide the resources for their mental and physical well-being. Then we've just used them. We've forgotten that, hey, they're more than just a caricature of G.I. Joe. They're full-fledged persons, and we asked them to give that up. We only recognize their full-fledged personhood and value and genuinely appreciate their service if we're willing to do what it takes to help them get that back. And I recorded this little rant quite a few days ago, and I think new and more and different information's coming out about both the dude who blew himself up in Vegas and the dude who attacked folks in New Orleans. So I don't know specifically how much of what I just talked about is relevant to either of those cases. I am certain that some of it will apply because so many of those stories are so very similar. I also know there might be some details that are different. If it turns out that the guy in Las Vegas was like way emotionally and mentally healthier than I don't think it affects the argument much. So there's a whole bunch of tangents you never thought were going to happen. Thanks so much for the time. That's more than enough for someone to talk about or think about today. Thanks for the time. If there were any topics that came up in this course of this video and you stuck it out this long, I really want you to mention it in the comments. Tell me what topics are interesting. None of what I did today was really like formal or robust philosophical argument. So if you're going to be judging it on those criteria, you're welcome to. I'm just not going to respond because it's not what I'm doing today. I hope it gave you some things to think about. You all are giving me tons to think about, and challenging the ideas I have or the way I present them or how effective or ineffective the videos I'm making is really cool because I get to grow and learn from that. So thanks for the time. I will see you soon. Thanks again.